This is story of Air Ontario Flight 1363, famously known as Dryden accident. The accident took place on March 10, 1989, involving Fokker F-28. This was a milestone investigation in human factors. The flight took off from Winnipeg, carrying 65 passengers. Weather was deteriorating, and it experienced delays due to de-icing. It flew to Dryden, Thunder Bay and back to Dryden. Later, it took off from Dryden and crashed, only after 49 seconds. 21 passengers and 3 crew members died, including both pilots. The root cause was failure of the crew to de-ice before takeoff, in heavy snow. Despite relatively minor loss of life, it led to one of the biggest investigations, conducted by a commission, headed by a judge of Supreme Court. FDR and CVR were completely destroyed. Investigation relied on the witness interviews, to determine the cause. Both pilots were inexperienced on F-28. It was last day of 6-day crew shift. With both engines shut down, an APU or GPU was necessary to restart the aircraft engines. The APU was incorrectly logged as unserviceable. GPU was not available at Dryden, due to decision by the company management. Therefore, captain could not shut down the engines to de-ice. The crew thought that the only options available to them were to attempt to take off without de-icing, or shut down the aircraft, and off-board the passengers and crew in Dryden, until a GPU could be brought to Dryden, the next day. The crew was also aware of shortage of hoteling facilities at Dryden. Also, dispatch had not updated the original flight info. Consequently, crew did not know of the additional passengers, or the deteriorating weather conditions. Crew had previously flown with modest ice on wings. Safety officer had resigned, due to lack of management support. Airline did not have its own F-28 flight operational manual. Pilots used F-28 flight operational manuals of 2 other airlines. The investigation identified multiple contributing factors, including regulatory factors, organizational factors and culture, environmental factors, and crew factors. Investigation also identified latent conditions at Dryden and cognitive load on the pilot. Latent factors at Dryden included that the regulator had failed to define de-icing requirements and audit jet program at Air Ontario. On the other hand, the airline did not have company manuals and minimum equipment list, had inconsistent training for jet operation. Plane was dispatched with maintenance issues. Flight attendants were not trained to alert pilots, and the captain was under pressure to complete flight to get home. The cognitive dilemma for the pilots was that there was no way to restart if engines were shut down to de-ice. Passenger could miss connecting flights. There were limited facilities for passengers at Dryden. Snowfall was increasingly heavy, with possibility of weather below minimums. Crew suffered stress of get home it is for weekend. The investigation concluded that airline competition resulted in lowering safety standards. Latent factors at regulatory and organizational level created an environment conducive to crew error. As a result, highly experienced crew made a series of decision errors. The inspections and audits of line behavior pointed to latent factors that are otherwise not observed. The investigation blamed Transport Canada for regulatory lapses, allowing expansion of Air Ontario with existing deficiencies. Based on the recommendations of the investigation, major changes were made in the Canadian aviation regulations. These changes included new safety regulations and refueling and de-icing procedures. It can be summarized that Air Ontario Flight 1363 investigation was the most extensive investigation in Canadian aviation history. However, the investigation did not point out one single cause of the accident. As a result, more than 200 recommendations for change were made. Most of those recommendations were related to regulatory factors, organizational factors, and human factors, which completely changed the aviation safety management in Canada. Now let us watch video reconstruction of the accident, highlighting the key findings of the accident.
It was a scheduled passenger service to Winnipeg, Manitoba. At the controls was Captain George Morwood, a safety-minded pilot with more than 30 years flying experience. His co-pilot was First Officer Keith Mills, a younger man with 10 years flying experience. The cabin crew on board Flight 363 were Catherine Say and Sonia Hartwick. Say was a flight attendant with 10 years flying experience who had earned commendations from passengers and airline management alike. Hartwick, with 2.5 years flying experience, was considered a valuable employee and was well liked by her colleagues.
Canada Radio, Ontario 363. We're ready for takeoff.
Following a short engine run-up, Flight 363 commenced takeoff. The aircraft rotated, but tragically failed to fly. After a second rotation on the takeoff roll, the aircraft battled to become airborne. It clipped trees and ploughed through a heavily treed ridgeline, eventually coming to rest in deep snow less than 1 kilometre from the end of the runway.
Come on!
24 people died. The Air Ontario crash prompted an immediate investigation by the then Canadian Aviation Safety Board. This was taken over by an exhaustive commission of inquiry into circumstances surrounding the accident. At the time, David Adams of the Australian Bureau of Air Safety Investigation was on exchange with the Canadian Aviation Safety Board. Adams led the Human and Survival Factors group of the investigation team and was subsequently appointed as a specialist investigator to the Commission. The Commission's findings reveal much about inadequate procedures, poor communications, and corporate pressures which combined to seal the fate of Flight 363.
There were several important factors which contributed to the crash of Flight 363. Things had begun to go wrong early that morning when the aircraft was dispatched from Winnipeg with an unserviceable auxiliary power unit. While this is a routine situation for flight crews, lack of ground start facilities at Dryden meant that it featured prominently in this particular accident sequence. In addition to this, Captain Morwood was under considerable pressure since the flight was way behind schedule by the time it came to take off at Dryden. It was the Friday of a long weekend, and passengers were anxious to make connecting flights. Ontario 363 had become more and more delayed throughout the day. This was mainly the result of poor weather, time taken to offload fuel so that extra passengers from another cancelled flight could be taken on board, plus being forced to delay takeoff in Dryden while a light aircraft attempted to land in heavy snow. However, these situations are neither unusual nor insurmountable for an experienced crew such as that on board Flight 363. These factors in isolation did not cause the aircraft to crash. To understand what led to the Dryden tragedy, we have to look more closely at the people involved and the circumstances leading up to the accident on March the 10th, 1989. We see that it was a combination of events and circumstances: poor communication between members of the crew, possible fatigue, stress, and corporate pressures, which all played an important part.
Flight 363 began its journey at Thunder Bay, where, according to the flight release, it should have had 55 passengers on board. But after everyone had boarded, it was discovered that there were, in fact, an additional 10 passengers. They had joined the aircraft after their Canadian partner flight was cancelled. As First Officer Mills calculated, the additional load meant that the aircraft would be overweight for a landing in Dryden. Captain Morwood's initial response was to avoid further delays by offloading the additional passengers. However, he was overruled by Air Ontario, and so decided to act according to whoever got to the aircraft first, the fuel company or the airline ticket staff.
Dispatch.
The fuel company was the first to arrive, so Captain Morwood asked for 3,000 pounds of fuel to be unloaded, with the inevitable consequence of a long delay and mounting frustration among the crew and passengers.
How much longer is this going to take?
If only I knew. If it's not one thing holding us up, it's another.
Look, don't worry, everything will be fine.
Don't those guys know what they're doing? We should have been told about those extra passengers a lot sooner. Now we're way behind schedule. And if you ask me, the ground crew is not doing enough to help us. Yeah, I agree.
Don't let this get to us. We'll pull through. Delays or no delays. Just think of the long weekend ahead.
Yes.
The aircraft crashed in a wooded area, approximately 926 meters from the end of the runway. It burned for some time. 24 people died, 21 were seriously injured, another 24 had minor injuries. No one escaped unharmed. Watching that sequence of events, it appears that ice on the wings of the F-28 was a key factor in the crash of Flight 363. It was the reason.
Captain Morwood therefore had to keep an engine running while the aircraft was refueled. To complicate matters further, the airline had a policy which prohibited de-icing of aircraft while the engines were running. So while Flight 363 sat waiting at Dryden for the distressed Cessna to land, Captain Morwood, following procedures, had to make a decision. Take off without de-icing or shut down the aircraft and strand his passengers there indefinitely. He knew there was inadequate accommodation for them in Dryden, and the aircraft, already running late, was due to be used on scheduled services later that day. Captain Morwood was also acutely aware that his crew were on the last day of their duty pattern and keen to get home to family and friends. Sadly, as it turns out, only one of them made it. No single factor has been pinpointed as the cause of the Dryden crash. The incident prompted one of the most intensive investigations ever carried out into an aircraft accident, and as a result, some 200 separate and broad-ranging recommendations for change have been made. As an examination of what happens when systems and communications are inadequate, it has lessons for all of us.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe my channel for more safety videos. Please press the bell icon for regular notifications.